War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with a huge World War III update. That's right, it is the end of January here in 2026, and as Donald Trump has said, a massive armada is moving towards the Middle East, towards Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Eastern Mediterranean, as, according to Israeli media, a U.S. strike on Iran is impending, according to Turkish intelligence, and the foreign minister of Turkey himself. An Israeli strike on Iran is pending very shortly. I mean, based on everything that has been going on and how soon the USS Abraham Lincoln and other carrier strike groups will be arriving in the region, the strikes could have occurred by the time you're listening to this or shortly thereafter. So stay prayed up for everything that's going on. But obviously, that's the biggest update. The Davos World Economic Forum meeting was this week. We're going to be discussing that, as well as updates from Venezuela, updates, of course, in Russia and Ukraine as major negotiations in Abu Dhabi went down recently. Of course, some big church news and some news on the domestic front regarding things going on with ICE and other immigration things. So big week of World War III analysis. It's good to be here with Dmitry. I want to, of course, remind everybody, please like this episode and the previous episodes. If you've listened to them, I always have been forgetting to remind people to like the episodes. We've lost a bit of seen a bit of a decline in the like count. So please smash the like button wherever you're listening to this, specifically on Substack, but also on YouTube, on X, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you may be listening to this. Hit the like button. It really, really helps us out. Share this podcast with your friends and family. And most importantly, check out this week's massive Ether Hour episode. You can get the full episode if you get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. And that episode this week is all about Rasputin. That's right, our most requested Ether Hour to date. So many people have asked us to do a deep dive on Rasputin. We had a fantastic guest, our friend Alex from Rasputin Archive, who was a good friend of mine in real life. He's a great guy. And it's a 3-part series. So part 1, we have already done about the origins, early life, and the life of Rasputin before he met the Romanov royal family, the royal martyrs. So we have part 2 and part 3 coming soon. And the part 1 is in full available on World War Now on the Substack. So check that out at the link down below. It will be the first thing linked that you will see below. So check that out. It is a really, really good episode. I think you're all going to really enjoy it. But with all of that, Dmitry, how are you doing? Big week of World War III analysis and big week of World War Now content.
Absolutely. WorldWarNow.co, our latest episode on Rasputin is absolutely amazing. I think everybody should listen to it. I think it's the most thorough breakdown of Rasputin's origins and early life on the English-speaking internet. And I know that's a boastful claim because there are, of course, authors, historians, experts from Russia who've written about Rasputin before, but to produce an audio-recorded analysis with all the deep research of both Russian and English sources, I think it is unprecedented. In fact, the end project will be essentially a whole new documentary on Rasputin's life, which will be probably longer than 6 hours, and that will be some of the exclusive content we'll be releasing on World War Now, probably on our YouTube channel as well. So stay tuned for that. 2026 is off to a blast. And I mean, speaking of blasts and, literally speaking, explosives and all these other materials of destruction moving towards the Middle East, at the moment we have the USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group. And that, of course, not just the aircraft carrier, the Abraham Lincoln Nimitz class, one of the largest aircraft carriers in the American Navy with all of its warplanes on board. It is also supported by 3 USS destroyers, right? So that is the Murphy, the Speranza, and the Peterson, as well as the Kaiser refueling ship. Now, how quickly are they moving from, of course, the Southeast Asia, India, and then through the Indian Ocean towards the Persian Gulf? Roughly around 40 kilometers per hour. So not very quickly. I mean, this big armada is moving at a very snail's pace, but they are expected to appear within the Arabian Sea and, of course, in strike range of Iran, roughly between the 25th and the 27th of January, 27th being at the latest. So definitely while you're listening to the episode, the Abraham Lincoln will be within strike range of southern Iran and the the Straits of Hormuz. So very interesting there because, of course, the US already has the 2 other destroyers actually waiting, along with another refueling craft, the Brashear, and the 2 destroyers, of course, the McFall and the Medsher. And those are located, again, in the Persian Gulf, close to Bahrain. So Iran will and truly is going to face 5 destroyers, an aircraft carrier, and most likely from Diego Garcia, there will be B-2 bombers. And Trump recently, Conrad, has also announced the purchasing of an entire new fleet of B-2 bombers. So that is exciting. I believe from between 20 and 25 of them, he said that America is going to purchase and make. Again, people are skeptical as to if they can even purchase that many, because again, this will double the American long-range bomber capacity. And these are stealth bombers, by the way, as well, which no other country really has. I mean, China claims to have developed at least archetypes or claims to have some sort of stealth bombers of its own. The Russian Federation does not have any stealth bombers of this particular range. So this is something that the US will absolutely surpass every other nation by. Now, notice, Conrad, again, that link between Iran and Israel and long-range bombers that have stealth capacity is because, well, Israel lacks these heavy carrying stealth bombers that can drop these tens of thousands of kilograms of explosives on a designated country or a strike target. So that's one thing Israel lacks. Israel does have, of course, its F-16s, F-17s, F-35s. It has one of the largest, basically, fleets of the Air Force in the Middle East. In fact, Israel's Air Force is only half the size of that of Russia, whilst Russia, I mean, the country is 14 times by population larger than Israel. So Israel's Air Force is a lot stronger than probably all of the other Gulf states combined, definitely twice, if not three times as powerful as that of Iran, and stronger than that of Turkey. So that's something to be contended with, especially when in combination with just even one aircraft carrier from America. Now, the destroyers are carriers of Tomahawk missiles, so we have to keep that in mind. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, so covering Lebanon, covering Hezbollah, we have the USS Roosevelt, another destroyer, the sixth destroyer. Also within, I mean, not sure, the Tomahawks probably couldn't reach Iran from the Eastern Mediterranean, but in any case, they can reach Iran's allies, IRGC targets with Tomahawks. And they have the USS Georgia, a nuclear submarine. The US also has that with additional long-range missiles that's located in the Eastern Mediterranean. So well and truly, all the bases are covered for a full-on Iranian long-range bombardment. Now, I do anticipate, Conrad, potentially that just like with the Venezuela situation and the recent protests in Iran, now this week, fortunately, they have died down. And in fact, Iran is undergoing right now a big purging operation. You know, they're taking all of these protesters to court. Some of them are actually scheduled to be hung, in fact, which was one of the major contentions that Trump put out. He doesn't want any protesters actually seeing the death penalty, despite the fact that there were lives of law enforcement, of Iranian law enforcement actually taken throughout some of the armed clashes during the Iranian protests. But it's in some capacity, when you draw the analogy and the comparison between Venezuela and Iran, notice the American fleets, they were stationed outside of Venezuela, and that in and of itself for about 2 months put such enormous pressure on the Venezuelan government that it appears that, I think, Conrad, and you'd probably agree, there was massive internal fear, paranoia struck into the hearts of those surrounding Maduro, and it appears that Maduro most likely was even betrayed by his own people, especially in high positions of power, because of that sheer force stationed outside of the country. So in a way, the protests inside of Iran, coupled with the American Navy standing at the ready, the powerful and, I would just say, demoralizing rhetoric of America and Israel saying that we're going to strike you at any time, we're going to have preemptive strikes again, 12-day war is going to restart. Maybe America will try to usurp power in Iran, or at least take down the supreme leader potentially, or Pezeshkian's government, without actually engaging in conflict, just simply by the sort of, well, it's not soft power pressure at this point, it's more like medium power pressure, without actually engaging or having boots on the ground or anything absurd of that nature. So who knows, there's multiple ways America, the Gulf states, and Israel can take this. And we understand at the moment, despite the various clashes between Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, their sort of interests colliding on the Horn of Africa, in northeastern Africa, and again in Yemen, I think they're all going to be united on the question whether or not, who are they going to side with, Israel, America, or Iran? Clearly, all the Gulf states, despite the differences, Conrad, their differences will be set aside, and they will side with, again, the former Israel and America. So that's the unfortunate side of things. Iran, despite all of its long-term projects to try and build up an alliance, try to bring itself closer to BRICS, sadly, I don't think the BRICS countries are powerful enough to actually intervene if another 12-day war project was going to commence, which maybe it'll be taking place this week. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how Iran handles itself, whether or not Iran actually forces the preemptive strike itself against Israel, or if it'll just wait for Israel to actually force the operation and maybe kill some scientists, or who knows. I mean, there's been a lot of talk by Israel that Iran is still keeping those centrifuges hidden somewhere. They still pose a danger and a threat to Israel and obviously to the entire world because of nuclear proliferation. So there's multiple points of interest, I think, for the Israeli regime to strike against Iran. And clearly, internal instability is not going to benefit the unfortunate regime of Khamenei and the 50-year-old regime that has already sort of solidified itself in Iran. Sadly, I think the pressure is going to be quite immense, and it's about to start when the USS Abraham Lincoln reaches the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf.
Now, as we've been saying since November, February 2026 seems to really be when the tale is going to be told. And Iran, a senior Iranian official, has told Reuters that Iran will treat any American attack on it as an existential threat and consider it a full-scale war. So obviously, America at this point knows exactly what they're getting into if Trump strikes. You can't say that, oh, it was a show of force. It was an attempt to de-escalate by, rattling the saber, by doing the strikes to make sure they understood we mean business. Like, no, this is it. The 12-day war again was the appetizer, and we're getting ready for the main course here. And as I mentioned earlier, we had Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. He reported to some Turkish media that there are signs that Israel is still considering an attack on Iran. And the reporter said, not from USA, but Israel. And he said, yes. So I'm assuming he means Israel, but he maybe said that so he has some kind of plausible deniability. But I don't see how Israel would be attacking in any situation without knowing America would attack with them. Maybe something will happen where America says, Israel, you do all of the attacking, but we will do all of the heavy lifting needed to defend. Some rumors are that THAAD and Patriot missile defense systems are on their way to Israel. We've obviously seen Major Iron Dome and David Sling and other missile defense systems deployed all over, the home front in Israel. So they are preparing for a strike. American forces are being moved around. RAF, Royal Air Force, I believe F-15s have been moved to Qatar for defensive purposes, they've claimed, because Iran has said that U.S. bases in the region and other allied bases will be the main targets. Trump today issued a threat to the Iraqi prime minister, claiming that if Iranian proxies and Iranian-backed militias or parties are part of the government and the military in the upcoming Iraqi government, then there will be major consequences. And I'm assuming that's because they fear that these Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq could interfere with strikes on Iran and could interfere with American bases in the region at the behest of the regime should a real war between these two countries, actually break out. And of course, we've seen the propaganda increasing and the atrocity propaganda getting more and more ridiculous about the protests and the news coming out. Obviously, Trump claims that the Iranians stopped all executions at his behest, but I believe a few executions have already gone forward. We've seen rallies, certain even young protesters, 19, 20 years old, are on schedule to be executed, and people are rallying against this. We're seeing claims from Reza Pahlavi supporters that up to 80,000 protesters were killed. I think that's a little bit high. According to the Iranian government, there have been about 3,200 casualties, with 2,000 plus of those, I think, being, according to them, like Basij and security forces and police. I think it's probably higher than that, but I have no reason to believe it's some of these crazy claims of 30 to 80,000. I would have a hard time believing it's much over 10,000. I would be very skeptical, but obviously the Iranian government has been extending the internet blackout supposedly as of today, which is Friday, January 23rd. The internet blackout over the next 24 hours will be slowly phased out entirely, although the rumors are that Iran is attempting to create a sort of great firewall like China and some of these other places, effectively, isolating Iran and Iranian netizens from the rest of the global internet. So we'll see how the fate of the Iranian internet goes, but I have a feeling that the moment any other strikes occur, that internet is getting shut back down, and they won't be turning it back on until they have that kind of alternative already established. But again, it's interesting how much Turkey is coming to Iran's defense. Erdogan and Pezeshkian have been calling on the phone a lot recently. Pezeshkian has obviously been escalating his rhetoric as a reformist. He was always more hesitant to speak against Israel in the West, but now he's openly denouncing the protests as a Zionist operation and these sorts of things. Erdogan has said that peace, security, and stability in Iran are of strategic and vital importance to Turkey. We already know, of course, that Turkish intelligence shared things with Iran about those Kurdish militias that went from Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan into Iran during the protests. And Iran was able to neutralize those extremely quickly due to this intelligence sharing. So Turkey does seem to really be in it for Iran to survive, for the regime to not collapse. I don't know if they are preparing to fill a vacuum, Dimitri. We were talking about this off air. If it's really genuine, if they're actually going to, when the bombs start falling, if they're going to provide any material support. It's clear that they're very willing to criticize Israel and eager because they get support from their population, and America seems to allow it. But as it showed with Hakan Fidan, he seems much more reticent to criticize America itself because Trump is very pro-Erdogan, and I think the State Department has a good relationship with Fidan, and they aren't trying to directly provoke them or try to criticize America or imply that there will be somehow Turkish consequences towards America if America goes forward with these strikes. Because in theory, Turkey could do a lot to hurt America. There's all sorts of bases and American assets within Turkey alone, not including the other things they could do with their trade routes and their control of certain waterways and their strategic positioning, obviously with the things going on in the Caucasus and things going on in Syria, but even just within Turkey, they could make things really difficult for the United States. But they're not going to do that because they know that the United States could come down on Turkey really hard. And the regime, the moment the United States decides that it's time for Erdogan to go, the regime will go. And it might even only take Israel truly putting their finger on the thumb and on the scale to fully get Erdogan to finally fall. But I think with this upcoming Iranian thing, it's clear that the strike will probably come from Jordan if it is through the United States, due to Saudi Arabia, Turkey obviously being against any operation like this at all. So it would likely come from Jordan, go over Iraq, which in theory, these Iranian militias in Iraq could do something about this, but they aren't particularly sophisticated. I don't think they've been able to get anything that could shoot down missiles. So we're going to be seeing exactly what kind of resistance Iran is able to muster. Obviously, they've been moving air defenses to the borders all across the strategic regions where they think that the strikes will be. I don't know if the strikes will be focused on where they think Iran is rebuilding its nuclear capabilities. We know that Israel's target is destroying their ballistic missile capabilities entirely, whereas the United States, their priority is clearly going to be regime change and decapitation. So I don't know if they're going to try to be killing the Ayatollah or basically killing everyone around him and forcing him to flee. They basically did that before without killing Pezeshkian and the Ayatollah. They pretty much took everyone else out. I guess Aragchi is still here as well. But besides those three, almost everybody else got taken out. So I don't know how they send any kind of message to the Ayatollah. And they realize also that killing the Ayatollah would be a fool's errand as well, because it would just turn him into a martyr and they would be able to rally around, the leader that refused to bend and, resisted the United States and Zionism up until the very end. So it's a tough calculation when you're faced with, religious fanatics that will die for their cause and believe in it at a fundamental ontological level. That's why Iran is a much tougher nut to crack than Venezuela, for example, for the United States. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about these impending strikes, which again, by the time people are listening to this, things could have dramatically changed in that direction to the point where the war has actually started and things are so kinetic that we're going to have to be going live and not pre-recording these episodes from here on out. But it seems that Syria is going to be one of the main places where all of this is being meted out, especially with Turkey, who is really becoming the major player besides Israel, Iran, and the United States itself in this, because we see this latest Damascus HTS SNA Turkish-backed offensive into SDF territory, and that seems to have gone forward with potentially the tacit green light from the United States, which does say a lot about how lateral Turkey feels that they can act in the region.
No, that's right. The biggest news, I think, from the Middle East, even just this week, is not even the preparation for war in Iran, as much as scary as that is. That is, in fact, what was looming over us since June 2025. So these news were, in a way, not as fresh as what took place in Syria. In fact, the absolutely insane move, which me and Conrad were anticipating. In fact, on last week's episode, we spoke about the strange balancing of powers taking place in Syria between the Kurds and the SNA/HTS, Turkish as well as Qatar, Saudi Arabia supported government of al-Shara al-Jilani. Finally, the balance has been broken. And in fact, just after the expulsion of essentially the Kurdish militia holding certain suburbs of Aleppo, the move has begun. So the integration that was proposed initially by America, in particular, not just al-Shara al-Jilani, but the American special envoy and the ambassador to Turkey, Tom Barak, the integration of essentially the Kurdish SDF into the SNA HTS official sort of army of Syria, that has fallen through early in 2025. And of course, in 2026, the eventual culmination of that is, well, essentially the escalation. The Arabs are now striking against the Kurds in full force. We saw the movement all across the border. So essentially from the center of Syria all throughout the northeast, pushing further northeast, eastwards, the Syrian army has been essentially in a matter of days, less than a week, has taken at least 3/4, if not just over half, of the territory held by the Kurds. Ostensibly, some of these cities and towns, most of the cities were quite small, so these are not comparable to Aleppo, Hama, Homs. Just keep in mind, most of them were villages, and urban warfare was not even an option, I think, for the Kurds, who just chose to evacuate these particular sites. The most important city, I think, on the Euphrates River, located about 160 kilometers east of Aleppo, that was seized by the official Syrian Arab government from the Kurds, was the city of Raqqa. And the most interesting thing is Raqqa, obviously, during the Syrian civil war in its early stages, was held and was actually announced to be the capital of the caliphate, right? The caliphate of ISIS. And ISIS was in fact well and truly stationed around Raqqa, and Raqqa had one of the oldest ISIS prisons actually located there. And what happened to the ISIS prisoners, Conrad? Not just the women and children who belonged to ISIS families; they were all liberated by the Syrian Arabs of al-Shara al-Jilani, but also just the actual physical male prisoners were liberated. Some people say close to 500 prisoners were let out by al-Jilani, al-Shara's government from the Raqqa prison. And some of these people obviously are some of the cruelest, most heinous, genocidal Sunni extremists that you can even imagine, right? So obviously they will find some similarities with the Salafi Wahhabis of al-Jilani, al-Shara's army. And obviously they did not see eye to eye with the Kurds at all, who were essentially keeping them in cages and in these prison cells. So in fact, now the Syrian army has been, let's just say, bolstered by extremists well and truly as they move towards the northeast and sort of close in on some of the last Kurdish-held cities. As that's happening, right, the Kurds essentially are, I think, at least the announcements are, they're not moving anymore. They're not going to retreat. They're going to hold major cities such as Qamishli in the northeast of Syria, literally on the Turkish border. And, as we speak, Conrad, one of the news stories that has dropped in the last 24 hours was a big Russian Ilyushin cargo plane actually landed in Qamishli, and it carried some sort of unknown cargo. So again, whether or not the Russians are actually trying to stop the expansion of al-Jilani, al-Shara, no, a little bit behind the scenes maybe, under the table. Maybe they're trying to bolster the Kurdish forces. We know the Russians at the beginning of the Syrian civil war actually fought against the Turks in some capacity, but have always rhetorically at least spoken about the plight of the Kurds against the Turks, the Armenians, the Azeris, despite the fact that they supported the Bashar al-Assad government. So the Russian position on this particular conflict between SNA and SDF is very much, I think they're most likely leaning towards the Kurdish angle, even though, the Kurds, of course, are supported and trained by America and Israel in large part. And, Tom Barak, I think him siding with al-Shara al-Jilani on this is quite strange. I think even the American administration is a little bit split on what's happening in Syria. So clearly this is a move that has been sanctioned from deep within the Trump administration, to the point where even Lindsey Graham, in fact, started pointing out that the jihadis were pushing the Kurds further eastwards. So he was calling his own American allies of the al-Shara al-Jilani government jihadis. And we've seen all kinds of very horrendous footage, as you do see when Islamic warlords tear a hole through a particular country, with them cutting off the hair of Kurdish girls and sort of carrying their locks of their hair as war trophies. There's all kinds of horrendous news, of course, from all over Syria that, ISIS and the Salafi fighters are taking war brides and all these other things that, of course, culturally enriching for the Syrian landscape, no doubt about that. Syria is moving so far from secularism and back into an Islamic dark age that we can't even react to it on time. But well and truly does show, Conrad, that at the end of the day, this Al-Qaeda ISIS blend that essentially originated in Idlib, and in fact, al-Baghdadi was killed in Idlib, and that's where al-Shara al-Jilani was from as well. It was real the entire time. So ISIS, ISIS affiliates, Al-Qaeda, HTS, al-Nusra Front, these were all basically birds of the same feather. These were basically the same species, just somehow co-inhabiting this evil jungle of Wahhabism and jihadis, takfirism in Syria. Now they've completely gotten loose, and Tom Barak and the Trump administration has released the leash, and now they're, of course, rampaging through an American-backed militia force, of course, created during the civil war, that is the Kurds. Quite sad for the Kurds, but who knows, Conrad, as we said before, the Kurds will most likely be used as a pawn by the Americans and Israelis in the future. Most likely maybe against Iran, maybe they'll be used against the Turks in the future. Definitely Erdogan is licking his lips, sort of watching the Kurds get destroyed like this in full-on capacity, because, of course, the Kurds have the PKK, they have Marxists, they have radical Kurdish independence fighters, of course, now trying to fight off this ISIS, Al-Qaeda-esque herd that's literally rushing at them at full speed. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how long the Kurds can actually hold off in northeast Syria. But none of us, I think, were expecting 3/4 or so of Kurdish territory to be lost in the span of less than a week. So this sort of blitzkrieg, the Arabian Wahhabi blitzkrieg, is a real thing. Like we saw it at the end of 2024, with the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime. And we're definitely seeing it now as the Kurds are being pressured. So it'll be interesting to see. But we've also had an interesting news story as well about the American bases located in Syria. Apparently, the Americans are trying to wrap up their Syrian operation, trying to move the Americans off of Syrian soil, maybe back to Iraq, perhaps, maybe back to the Gulf states, who knows. But definitely the ISIS prisoners, American prisons located close to their bases in southeastern Syria, actually held 7,000 ISIS inmates. And these are, again, women, children as well, and males of the ISIS persuasion. Most likely Americans have had torture sites as well located there. Those 7,000 ISIS prisoners will now be moved to Iraq in order to, again, defend them from liberation. Because who knows, maybe the al-Gilani regime will turn its head towards the south and just begin going on this liberation of ISIS prisoners rampage that they've kind of commenced here in the center of Syria, in the city of Raqqa. So overall, seeing the ISIS flag being flown at the gates, at the entrance to Raqqa, really does sort of bring us back to 2015, 2016, the golden age of the caliphate. And I think Syria is well and truly back in this sort of swampy, Wahhabi, Salafi dredges that it tried to crawl itself out of, really pull itself out of, unfortunately, with Russian and Iranian help, and just didn't amount to anything at the end of 2024. So Syria is as divided as ever. And if there is any unity, Conrad, the unity is the unity of the crescent and the saber, really. It's the unity of the Emir al-Shara al-Jalani. So unity through tyranny is the only thing that is potentially the guarantee for the future of the Syrian people, quite sadly.
No, unfortunately for the Kurds, they've been relegated to a status, frankly, below even the Druze. Like you said, Dimitri, America seems to indicate that, and press releases have declared that America is weighing the options of completely pulling out of Syria altogether. They seem to, if Tom Barak's, as you mentioned, of his latest remarks are correct, he seems completely satisfied with how al-Jalani al-Shara is running Damascus and seems content in allowing him to rule an unfederalized, total control, centralized Syria, where the Kurds, who before now, just a few days ago, were a force controlling a very large section of Syria, backed up with a large Kurdish population in Iraq, Muslim Abdi controlling 100,000 forces, the largest contingent of, American, Israeli, regionally supported forces against kind of the Turkish, Qatari, Damascus axis that's currently emerging right now. They now control a fraction of the territory they controlled before, simply a few towns at this point and some areas backing up to Iraqi Kurdistan. And now even America, again, their main ally, seems to have abandoned them. Obviously, Iran is completely against them at this point and has moved towards Turkey. America seems to have given Turkey and their proxies in Syria free reign to rule that country, which apparently the only people that concerns is Israel. So the Kurds are going to be cozying up to Israel very closely because they are, at this point, the only people that really are supporting them. And of course, we have the Iranians who, obviously, as we said before, the PAK and the PKK, these other SMK, these other Kurdish militias that were neutralized thanks to Turkish intelligence sharing with the IRGC. Recently, this is from Bel Makda. It says the Kurdistan Freedom Party claims that the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has conducted a drone strike and ballistic missile strike against the positions of its armed wing, the Kurdistan National Army, in Duhok, northern Kurdistan region of Iraq. The attack reportedly occurred on January 21st, 2026, so a few days ago. And obviously, Iran operating in Iraq, obviously, America is not retaliating for this, despite Iran ostensibly violating Iraqi sovereignty. But the Iranians are making it clear that they're not going to be supporting any kind of Kurdish nationalism within Iran. But if these strikes against Iran go through, maybe that's the trade-off that America is weighing with their Kurdish allies. You're going to have to concede, or rather cede Syria, take the Rojava out of Syria. Syria is no longer part of Kurdistan, but with the capital of Kurdistan still being in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan, we will expand Kurdistan eastwards into Iran, and Iranian Kurdistan will be joined up with Iraqi Kurdistan, and that will be how a Kurdish state emerges. But in theory, if Turkey also is somehow fought back and withdrawn from Syria, then in theory, Syrian Kurdistan would also join up with this large Kurdish state, which if you listen to episode 147, last week's World War Now, we discussed exactly what the prophecies say about Kurdistan and Metropolitan Neophytos' recent remarks. So the Kurds are very much becoming relevant players, which makes sense as a 40 million strong nation. It would make sense that their constant fight for this nation state and their use as a proxy by other powers as a very relevant demographic within this critical region of the Levant and the Middle East, then it makes sense why there's such a focus of these prophecies. But Turkey, of course, is not backing down Erdogan seems to be on top of the world right now with the full support of the United States. He's not friends with the Iranians, the Saudis, even the Egyptians are allowing them to fly flights to southern Egypt to fight against the RSF and arm the Sudanese armed forces. We're going to talk about that in a second, but this is from Ram Navarim here. It says, Turkey has deployed the HTRS-100 radar system to Damascus International Airport in Syria. The radar can detect all airborne targets within a range of up to 115 miles. Israeli Channel 15 confirmed the deployment and claims it severely restricts Israel's freedom of action in Syrian airspace. The south of Syria was a corridor Israel relied on to approach Iranian borders in the 12-day war. So, big escalation from Turkey, both pro-Iranian and pro-Syrian. We know that Israel was able to strike the Damascus airport almost with impunity ever since the fall of the Assad regime. Even before the fall of the Assad regime, they would do it all the time. But in theory now, with this radar system and hopefully new air defense systems potentially, well, not hopefully, just objectively, then it seems that Syria will no longer be just a place for Israel to fly through and, like this says, a air route and just a free Israeli airspace for the taking. So it's clear that Israel is, from their own perspective, correct to be concerned about the growth of Turkish influence, and they've already set up Turkey as the big boogeyman when, at least in their mind, if things go as the way they want, this U.S. strike really does take out the Iranian regime. But I think Turkey and Erdogan knows that he doesn't want to face the full brunt of Israeli soft and hard power, because the Israelis will quickly turn the United States against Turkey diplomatically. And then whatever color revolution, if Ekrem Imamoglu or some other Kemalist tries to come to power, they will be quickly supported by the U.S.-Israeli axis to overthrow Erdogan, and then the prophecies are on their way. So I think it's clear why, for regional reasons and just for personal political reasons, why Erdogan is going to be somewhat committed to having the Iranians stay in power, at least for now, until maybe they can consolidate themselves to be the regional superpower. Because if Iran goes, it really is going to be Turkey versus Israel for total control of the Middle East and really the center of the world island. And that's where the UAE really comes into play, because they're still the only real Islamic power, I guess, on top of Azerbaijan, which when it comes to Turkey, that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays. But the UAE is maybe regretting their switch to the Israeli-American side so soon, because Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, they're all coalescing, and it seems that it may be enough. If Iran can weather this next storm, at least initially, maybe the Islamic axis was enough to weather the attempt by Israel to become the sole regional hegemon. And maybe the Israeli 80-year curse is going to come to pass, because we are at year 77, almost year 78. At May 2026, that will be 78 years since the founding of Israel. So tick-tock, the prophecies, the 80-year curse, these things are about to come to pass. And I think February 2026, like I said, is going to be when we really see a lot of these fireworks start to go off. But I'd love to hear any final thoughts you have on Turkey and Syria, Dimitri, before we talk a little bit about the UAE and Africa, before moving on to Lebanon and Gaza.
Only that I think these essentially solidification of Syria under one particular government, in particular the one of al-Shara al-Jilani, the stabilization of Syria in some way could only be eventually for the purposes of actually coordinating some sort of resistance to Iran, potentially, in order to protect Israel's northeastern borders, but also potentially, who knows, after the Kurds are all done, who knows where the jihad will go next. It can be turned in some capacity against countries unwilling to support Israel. So if Jordan ever wishes to turn against Israel, there's already been threats to essentially for the jihadi Salafis to go further south and culturally enrich Jordan and to get rid of the evil British tyrant, the one that rules over Jordan. Then again, there are also threats to cleanse Lebanon from the Shia there. So again, we know that al-Shara al-Jilani does not necessarily look fondly upon Hezbollah, who he sees as a Iranian proxy. So all of this taken into consideration, a now radicalized Syrian army, of course, with military experience that we've seen, now that they're, of course, training and practicing on the Kurds, will, of course, be a force to be reckoned with. It could even be used to later go further down towards the southeast into Iraq in order to, again, maybe oppose an Iranian expansion if the war between Iran and Israel gets out of hand. So it's a particular token force that can be used by US, Israel, and particularly Turkey. We have to keep in mind there's a reason why Tom Barak, the US ambassador to Turkey, is also the special envoy to Syria. Of course, Syria, at the moment, al-Shara al-Jilani answers first and foremost to Turkey before he answers, I think, to any of the Gulf states who are giving him bucket loads of money and free funding, essentially, or Israel and America, who give him cologne, shake his hand, and praise him for the number of wives that he has. So it's all very interesting there. But generally speaking, Israeli aggression, again, continues in southern Lebanon as well. Just on the borders of Syria, there's constantly, of course, innocent civilians essentially dying and being killed by Israeli bombs. And while the Ummah, the Sunni Muslim community of the Middle East, remains essentially silent, just as they were in the Palestinian issue, and the countries that, in question, in particular, the richest Sunni Muslim countries of the Gulf states, of course, the UAE, Qatar, the most per capita wealthy, fat, and absolutely lazy states, you can almost say, but they're lazy only in relation to assisting the poor people of Gaza, the poor people of Lebanon and Syria. Again, they're not lazy when it comes to overseas operations or operations abroad in neighboring countries such as Yemen, such as Sudan, or even some sort of scheming in the Horn of Africa when it comes to Somaliland. So the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia have really made themselves quite clearly these expansionist, almost proxy warfare specialists in some ways. All of the blaming and finger pointing, Conrad, that was put on Russia before, they're claiming that Wagner is destabilizing Africa and all of this. Notice that the same threats and the same messaging is never being pointed at, and those accusations are not thrown out by Western media at any of these Arab Gulf states who are both allies of Israel and America. Essentially, they're given a completely gloves off. The American US media washes their hands and allows the Gulf rich states to do as they please in all of these poorer countries of Africa, essentially tearing them apart and winning territory as well as political control. Sudan being the best example, with the RSF committing absolutely some of the worst atrocities we saw of last year. And that's saying a lot because we still had the bombarding of Lebanon, Gaza, and we've still had, of course, bombing in Syria and all kinds of other atrocious operations by Israel. And yet the RSF in Sudan, supported by the UAE, committed some of the worst atrocities of 2025. Obviously some of the massacres, which they could be seen from low orbit satellites as well. So completely insane. And yet the UAE is not answering to anyone. They're given a complete carte blanche over here. So that's very telling us that if you're American and Israel is an ally, you will not be questioned. And a good example is, of course, Ukraine committing terror acts across Russia and not being critiqued for all of their behaviors. So similar thing with the UAE, very same story.
Yeah, the UAE, as it says here, has retaliated to its loss to Saudi Arabia and Yemen by increasing its support for the rapid support forces in Sudan, reaching unprecedented levels. This is from French think tank Africa Intelligence. Relations between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are beyond repair, with the UAE seeking to draw Saudi Arabia into a prolonged confrontation in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa. That seems to be the UAE's current play, of course. The RSF has reportedly been recruiting in Ethiopia. They've expanded into there. Ethiopia, of course, is allied with the UAE because Somaliland has promised Ethiopia a port there. So Ethiopia is generally speaking on the UAE Israel axis, whereas Sudan and Egypt are aligned in the more Turkish axis now, even though Egypt, formerly a Turkish rival, has now sort of cleaved back into the Turkish fold, as Greece, who used to be allied with Egypt against Turkey, has gone full Israel, Ethiopia, and Sudan. And of course, Ethiopia and Egypt have the huge conflict over the Grand Renaissance Dam, which if Egypt doesn't, address that properly, then it's going to really have a problem for their population and their water supply. So of course, Turkey has really been, their news publications and their propaganda outlets have been, really emphasizing the Greek-Cyprus-Israeli axis and saying that, as we defeat Israel, we're also going to defeat Greece. So again, put your prophecy hats on and maybe go back and listen to episode 147 and some of the earlier Ether Hour episodes. Things are getting very, very interesting with how these prophecies could potentially go. And again, Russia, the United States, these players are going to be the ones that, when they decide what they're really going to do, whether it's going to be the U.S. is going to break up NATO and go against Turkey, or if there's going to be regime change, or if Erdogan's going to somehow last well into the prophetic predictions and Russia is going to be siding with Israel in their war against Turkey and, siding ostensibly on the side of Greece and Israel in that regard, with sort of the Islamic world led by a neo-Ottoman Turkey has sort of emerged as the new leader, and that's how the prophecies are going to go. I still don't think that's how things are going to go, but if things don't change dramatically with the, the overthrow of Erdogan and, potentially things not going a certain way with Israel, then things could very much go that more negative direction. But one thing as far as the Iranian strikes go, which is very relevant, is that Keir Starmer has withdrawn a bill in the UK Parliament that would have transferred the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, that they would have officially been owned by Mauritius with this lease still going towards the UK and the US for them to use it. But I think Trump put pressure on the UK not to do this. Of course, the Chagos Islands in theory could be very relevant for strikes on Iran. That was where we thought that strikes would come from before, when in reality they came from all the way across the world. They flew, I believe, from like Nebraska or Missouri or wherever it was. But in theory, the Chagos Islands could be a very relevant place when it comes to these strikes. So this refusal to transfer them over to Mauritius is even more telling towards that direction. But as far as the specific RS support for the rapid support forces from the UAE and the Israeli axis here, this is also from Rerim Navarim here. It says, for the second consecutive day, and this is as of today, Turkish military cargo planes have arrived at Shark El Oanat Airport in southern Egypt on the border of Sudan. Its repeated use indicates a likely deal between Egypt and Turkey, where Cairo has granted the latter the rights to use its facilities in the south to arm the Sudanese armed forces against the rapid support forces. The use of southern Egypt will save Ankara from its current route of transporting all the way to Port Sudan, and also the equipment can arrive at the Darfur front much faster. Sharq El Owanat Airport is indented to serve as a domestic-only airport for the land reclamation project at Sharq El Owanat. Despite Egypt's pressure on eastern Libya's Haftar-led Libyan National Army, the southeast of Libya continues to be used as a staging ground for the RSF. In fact, recent satellite imagery shows an increased activity in RSF camps in the area. So the RSF really is a sort of trans-African movement. They have allies in Chad, they're trained in Libya, they're now recruiting in Ethiopia. And of course, South Sudan is now plunging into the conflict as well as of the past few days. So UAE's, again, they're fallen Yemen, as it said. They've rerouted all of those resources into Africa. So the Sudan civil war is seemingly, it could expand out into being the new center of another Pan-African war. So we're going to be watching all of that very closely. But of course, Israel, the root of all of these problems, the UAE wouldn't be able to do this without, trusting their brother Israel, backed up by the United States. The UAE, the biggest single investor in, Trump's new America, as he's calling it. They have, I think, $100 billion more than the Saudis, who before this one had been the largest investors. So the UAE, powerful players, currently hosting the Russia-Ukraine negotiations that are going on right now, which we're going to discuss later. But Israel, the ones backing them up, are currently violating the ceasefire extensively in Lebanon. 2 days ago, the 21st of January, massive strikes across Hezbollah depots all over southern Lebanon, and strikes getting up into central and northern Lebanon as well. So the war on Lebanon continues. Certain Lebanese forces have continued to counter-signal Hezbollah, despite the fact that Israel is nakedly violating their sovereignty and killing their citizens. So the Lebanon situation we're going to watch closely, because if, as Trump has been demanding the past few days, decisive strikes against the Iranian regime are carried out, Hezbollah has pledged that they will spring into action. And the United States has been, I think the United States wants it to play where Israel takes out Hezbollah and they take out Iran. But Israel, I think, has been very hesitant to take on Hezbollah again because Hezbollah did so much damage to their north the last time that went down. So obviously we're going to be watching the Lebanon situation closely. The other big news from Palestine, before we discuss the Gaza Board of Peace, which was the big news immediately following the World Economic Forum in Davos. All the global elites were met at this globalist function that every year comes around. But unfortunately, we saw in Bethlehem, Palestine, IDF forces engaged in a large-scale incursion into the Manger Square and the Church of the Nativity itself, which is the largest Christian area in Bethlehem. They arrested multiple people for reasons that remain unclear. You can find the footage of this on the World War Now Telegram at World War Now Telly. Again, we still don't really know all the details about this, but it's just another sign of the Israelis. They view the Christians, I think, as even more of a threat to their goals to take over all of Palestine and make greater Israel than even the Muslims, because, even though the Christians at this point are a tiny 2 to 3% of the population, as they've been reduced to since, the Nakba and the Israelis came in, they still target them regularly in Taibeh in Palestine, which is one of the last Christian-only cities and towns in Palestine. The Israelis are really moving on them right now. We know that the Christian areas were targeted by strikes in the Gaza war, and now they're moving on the Christian areas of Bethlehem. So I've always said that I think the Israelis would always rather live with specifically Sunni Muslims than they would ever rather live with any kind of Christian, especially Orthodox Christians, who make up the majority of the Christians in Bethlehem and in Palestine. So very unfortunate to see. But of course, before we discuss all of the WEF and things, we have to discuss the Gaza plan. Of course, Jared Kushner, executive member of the Gaza Board of Peace. Of course, Hakan Fidan of Turkey is on the Board of Peace, the presidents of Indonesia. Vladimir Putin was invited to be on this, as was Zelensky. Of course, Germany, France, the UK, I think, declined to participate on the Board of Peace. So those are just a few of the members. Of course, Pakistan, the majority of the Islamic world, is represented in some capacity. Of course, Iran is nowhere near this at all. But Jared Kushner has sort of preached this new glitzy Gaza revamp plan with these smart cities and whatnot. And this is from Hamza Attar on Twitter. It says the social engineering of the Gaza Strip. And there's these maps, and it shows a pink zone for the rich people, a yellow zone for the workforce. And it has all these maps that have exactly how the smart cities are going to be all laid out. It says there's no border with Egypt. It all goes through Israel. The Rafah crossing will have disappeared. The shifting balance from Gaza City to Khan Yunis and Rafah. So Gaza City will no longer be the population center. It will be farther to the south, I guess also to protect Israel. The border, the industrial hubs will rely on Israel for the supply chain and electricity and be cut off whenever Israel wants. Rafah and Khan Yunis are being engineered as attractive cities to move Palestinians away from Gaza City towards the south, emptying the north and reconstructing the social fabric. The new port was moved to Rafah to be adjacent to the Israeli-occupied area. It's an Israeli-controlled port. next to the port, a marina for the rich, pay attention to blah, blah, blah. The cities are separated by agricultural land with no natural horizontal expansion. So yeah, it's a new technocratic takeover. Of course, there are a lot of Palestinians on the lower tier of the Board of Peace who will ostensibly execute the civilian day-to-day of things on the ground. But Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the latest from Gaza. Jared Kushner's everywhere. Him and Witkoff and some other Jews were in Russia handling things there. Now he's in Davos handling things for Gaza. He's going to be in Abu Dhabi, I'm sure, handling things there. I mean, what's next? Is he going to, just make this guy the president of the world at this point?
People have always said Jared Kushner, just his link to Chabad Lubavitch, his respect for the former Antichrist Moshiach of Chabad Lubavitch, and obviously the big link to the entire Talmudic Hasidic community in Russia, and his ostensible relationship with Steve Witkoff, because Jared Kushner does not hold an official position in the U.S. government, in Trump's cabinet, in the administration at all. Just like he held an actual official position during the first Trump administration, but not this one. In fact, he's just Trump's family member traveling around the world and doing all these crazy antics. And obviously this shows as to who exactly is behind all this power, doesn't it really? This is quite on the nose, no pun intended. But the interesting thing is there has been a lot more countries this week that have signed on to Trump's Board of Peace Charter. And Trump, just to as a show of force, actually removed and withdrew his invitation of Canada to the Board of Peace. And he actually sent out an invitation to Belarus, and Alexander Lukashenko ostensibly and gladly signed it. In fact, Vladimir Putin also received an invitation, and Putin, this actually happened at the same time as another very interesting Palestine-related event. So Vladimir Putin met up with Mahmoud Abbas and a Palestinian Authority West Bank-led government. Obviously, we know Gaza is well and truly commanded by Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority, which holds essentially supreme rule, so to speak, politically over the West Bank, they traveled to Moscow. They met with Vladimir Putin. He gave Mahmoud Abbas, the 90-year-old Palestinian leader who isn't necessarily a Zionist oppositionary person. In fact, a lot of axis of resistance folks that you see online, even including Jackson Hinkle, people like that, people who are very Brixian, very multipolarist, they dislike Mahmoud Abbas because they say he doesn't proclaim from the river to the sea. He's not an anti-Israeli spokesperson as those members of Hamas that have started the whole October 7th operation in the first place. So they say Mahmoud Abbas is a moderate, but it appears that Mahmoud Abbas, Conrad, is the one whom China and especially Vladimir Putin and Russia is actually putting the bets on. In fact, Mahmoud Abbas is the one they trust. President Putin directly called him the president of Palestine, gave him a hug, and the 90-year-old Mahmoud Abbas was then promised by Putin to be given, well, at least the Board of Peace was to be given $1 billion American. This is the entry fee to sign on to the charter of the Board of Peace. And President Putin said, look, Trump needs to in some way recognize the Palestinian people's authority in this relationship with Israel. But what he means by that is obviously Vladimir Putin is not saying Hamas needs to be recognized or any of these Islamist movements in Gaza. He's saying Trump and the Board of Peace need to account for Mahmoud Abbas, who, by the way, has not been invited to the Board of Peace. In fact, the whole Board of Peace of Gaza, Conrad, has no Palestinian voices on it. Yeah, it does have other Islamic countries, like one of them is a member of BRICS. Indonesia, Pakistan is there, Morocco, Jordan, Kazakhstan, of course, in Kazakhstan, you can count that as a majority Muslim country, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Shia Muslim country, UAE, Uzbekistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and even a country like Armenia has already signed onto the Board of Peace invitation as well. So notice the Board of Peace also, Conrad, it's not just the fact that it's a Chabad Lubavitch operation and it's just an extension of the Abraham Accords. It's also having Alexander Lukashenko, Vladimir Putin speak out, essentially in favor of the Board of Peace project, in favor of this smartification, the smart city rebuilding of Gaza, turning it into this essentially not post-apocalyptic, but essentially apocalyptic Antichrist project, right? Can you imagine how many CCTV cameras are going to be installed across Gaza once we're all done here? And of course, the leaders of Hamas will be kicked out. It'll be absolutely, most likely there'll be microchips installed into the Palestinian citizens of Gaza and those Israelis who are going to move in as well. It's absolutely horrific. Seeing BRICS countries like Belarus, Russia, Indonesia align with this and essentially accept it is quite horrific. I think it's quite scary. It really shows that the Israeli influence reaches far and wide. Even, of course, Hungary, well, we know Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, he is very much pro-Israeli. He's an anti-Islamist. He doesn't like Islamic Muslim migrants. So he, of course, accepted the Board of Peace Charter invitation and has paid his $1 billion entry fee. So it's quite telling. And this is all taking place where? In Davos, among the globalists, literally the new Bilderberg group meetup. It's about as globalist as you can get. It's literally taking place in Switzerland, in this ostensibly neutral country. And it's quite a bad foreshadowing, I think, for the people of Palestine and Gaza. I mean, despite all the bombardments, there's no condemnation of Israel that's taking place. There's just they're moving on with the whole Gaza saga, Conrad, as if, it was a big misunderstanding. The policing operation of Israel, it just went out of hand a little bit. But now, don't worry, we will rebuild your city. Well, we're all going to contribute, and we're going to, the New World Order will restore your destroyed homes, and you will move into an apartment with essentially hidden microphones locked in. There's going to be cameras everywhere. There's going to be fresh highways. We're going to turn essentially Gaza into a mini Bahrain. Don't worry about that. It'll all be under control. Israel's blessing is here as well. So Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, of course, is still pushing their agenda, as you said, in the West Bank. Ben-Gvir, in fact, has approved gun licenses for residents of 18 illegal settlements across the West Bank. So now they can have essentially they can concealed carry, they can open carry, they can hold assault rifles. So there are kibbutzes, illegal settlement expansions all over the West Bank. But this isn't even a subject matter that was discussed at Davos by the World Economic Forum, of course, formerly led by Klaus Schwab, a good friend of Pope Francis, in fact. So a Roman Catholic, Klaus Schwab, just keep that in mind. So for those saying the Roman Catholic Church opposes these globalist incursions on national sovereignty and globalism, that's not the case. Unfortunately, the former Pope, and I think the current Pope Leo as well, are well and truly contributors to all of this. So just very sad that BRICS at the moment, Conrad, has basically conceded on the whole Board of Peace issue, and Vladimir Putin himself, obviously, with his essentially hugging of Mahmoud Abbas, has sealed the deal for the axis of resistance, at least in this particular front. The only countries remaining in the axis right now, of course, Yemen, of course, held by the Houthis, partially Lebanon, led by Hezbollah and Iran. Besides that, of course, this axis, which was promoted so heavily online, I think rather artificially has more or less collapsed. That crescent moon of the Middle East in opposition to the Zionist Israeli project and the genocide of Gaza is well and truly over. So that it's at least been cut in half. So it'll be very interesting to see where all of this goes. But generally speaking, Conrad, there's been a lot of talks in Davos. People have been discussing, I think the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia has actually warned about the impending economic crisis of the world. He said, look, this AI bubble is a potential threat, like the obviously growing inflation around the world, countries, especially in the Muslim world and in Asia, that are suffering from overinflation. There's a growing debt bubble that's ever increasing. And he said that potentially, it is the World Economic Forum. So they were discussing economics for most of the 5 days there. And there are some real considerations about what exactly the world economy will look like. Naturally, a lot of talk as well about, transhumanistic type digitization of the economies, right? Cryptocurrency integration, digital dollarization, things like this. These are all very, I would say, subjects which we discussed with Anthony of Westgate on many former AF-Hour episodes, which you should go listen to. These are all very globalist, subjective talking points, which for some reason has been normalized recently, unfortunately, and really people have stopped pointing out just exactly how insidious they are, in fact, in sort of creating a new world order. But that's exactly what's happening in the World Economic Forum, with Trump essentially giving his additional outlook. This is probably the biggest news coming out of Davos on the whole Greenland subject, right? He's essentially said that we're reaching a deal, and it will not include, of course, a military intervention by the US. Trump did say we can militarily engage and actually take Greenland for ourselves, but we are reaching a deal. And I think what strikes me as a potential possibility, Conrad, is that, Denmark at the moment has really negatively signaled this whole Trump Greenland project. They've really said they're against it openly to the public. Maybe there are things being negotiated behind the scenes, but Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, has in fact spoken out somewhat in favor of it, in fact. So that's a little bit scary. He said, of course, he's the one who called Trump daddy a couple of times, which was quite cringy and weird. But in any case, he appears to be Trump's puppet in this whole discussion. So Greenland, for a large part of its history since the Second World War, has been reliant on essentially this NATO shield being provided. So of course, if the General Secretary of NATO, Mark Rutte, agrees to, putting that shield down and to have Greenland integrate itself with America bloodlessly, there will be no opposition from Denmark. I'll just keep one more point, just putting it down on paper, just for people to not side with Denmark a little bit too much, right? The point about Denmark is, Conrad, since the mid-1700s, the Danish kings, and this includes, of course, King Christian IX, essentially the father-in-law of Alexander III. So Alexander III's wife, Maria Fyodorovna, was Dagmar, the princess of Denmark. She was the daughter of Christian IX, and every king since the 1700s in Denmark was a Freemason. In fact, one of the heads of the main Masonic lodges in Denmark itself. So just keep that in mind. Denmark is a heavily Masonized monarchy. Yes, it is a constitutional monarchy. And so to sort of paint Denmark as this positive country that somehow opposes Trump's unification New World Order project, I think is somewhat incorrect. We are essentially looking at predatory, an interspecies combat here. These are two heads of the same hydra biting at each other and essentially having a light rhetorical combating, at least before making Greenland, I think potentially at the end of all of this, Conrad, Trump is not wasting his time with Greenland. I think Greenland will and truly, maybe even before the end of this year, will be integrated into the US. And one of the saddest points about this, and I just have to mention this, that Vladimir Putin was asked about his opinion on the Greenland project, right, of Donald J. Trump. And he said, Russia has no position about this. He went off into this political, rhetorical rant about the sale of Alaska to the US to make it an American state and all this nonsense. But the point is, people for the longest time, for the last 2 decades, have been speaking about Russia's geopolitical interests in the Arctic. And yet Vladimir Putin himself has conceded and said, essentially he confirmed Russia will not be opposing America's acquisition of Greenland, whether by force or by diplomacy, or simply by purchasing it. There will be no issues there. So Vladimir Putin, in fact, is in some ways giving up Russia's complete dominance of the Arctic. At the moment, Russia is the dominant force in the Arctic, and essentially inviting the Trump administration. Why that's being done, Conrad, I'm not sure. Is it the Kushner? Is it the Witkoff angle? Is it Chabad Lubavitch telling Putin to not, even present some sort of even rhetorical obstacle to Trump's expansion into Greenland? But in any case, this is a concession of Russia's long-term interests, allowing America so freely and easily just take Greenland. And I mean, some of these quotes will definitely haunt Putin, and the history books will definitely view this as a point of Russian concession to America's domination. As I said before on the show many, many times, for some strange reason, ever since the last year, the early 2025 inauguration of President Trump, Russian concessions to Trump have been massive. They haven't even, in fact, there's no criticism of Trump, personally speaking. Maria Zakharova, Sergei Lavrov, Dmitry Medvedev, even Vladimir Putin, they've been constantly giving concessions to Trump rhetorically, even politically. And I don't know why that is. Either they want Trump on their side against the EU. Maybe they have this illusionary view that Trump is going to somehow end the war in Ukraine. But overall, I think the outcome will be a net negative for Russia in the long term. But in any case, I think Trump has really shown himself as the biggest fish in the whole EU NATO pond. Like, everybody was listening to his speech. Nobody's other talks even came close. Even Macron appeared to be a Lilliput, a small man, a small little dwarf compared to Trump. Trump caught the attention of everybody speaking at Davos, and his presentations were absolutely central to the entire event. So much for the QAnon MAGA folks who are saying Trump is against the New World Order, when here he is at World Economic Forum in Switzerland at Klaus Schwab's meeting. So quite interesting.
Yeah, and of course, we saw Zelensky, for example. He said that the fact that if the Khomeini regime in Iran is allowed to survive, it will only teach other dictators that if you kill enough people, you can stay in power. So Zelensky is, fully going after Iran. He knows that's where the drones that are coming after him come from. And he knows that, that's what the focus of the Americans are right now. So he's trying to, get as much good boy points from Donald Trump, as he can. And of course, like you mentioned, Dimitri, you're right. Trump's Greenland remarks were sort of the focus. I think the most kind of consequential remarks from his speech, he said, this enormous unsecured island is actually part of North America. It's on the northern frontier of the Western Hemisphere, our hemisphere. So Trump is, really claiming it. This is from Kyle Anzalone. It says, President Donald Trump said the agreement he's negotiating regarding Greenland will give the U.S. total access. It's really being negotiated now, the details of it, but it's essentially total access. There's no end. There's no time limit, Trump said in an interview on Thursday. We will have everything we want. We're getting everything we want at no cost. Of course, you mentioned earlier, Dimitri, he was talking with Mark Rutte, the NATO General Secretary, and, they were claiming to have come to an agreement about American sovereign military bases, sort of the similar agreement that Cyprus has with the British bases at Dhekelia and Akrotiri, which are sovereign British territory. The area surrounded is the United Kingdom. And so in theory, huge parts of Greenland would be American sovereign territory, these military bases. But we have recently, it says here, Danish Prime Minister shoots down talk of U.S. sovereign bases in Greenland. It says she is open to an agreement on Greenland with the U.S. only as long as Denmark's territorial integrity is respected. NATO is fully aware of the Kingdom of Denmark's position. We can negotiate on everything political, security, investments, economy, but we cannot negotiate on our sovereignty. I've been informed that this has not been the case. So that's where the Danes are coming from here. Meanwhile, Putin is, like you said, Dmitry, sort of pretending this doesn't matter, saying, oh, Greenland might be worth $1 billion, which I don't know, are the Russians, pretending that maybe they're trying to save face, and because the Alaska thing was a big L, because if the Russians had never given up Alaska, they would undoubtedly have still been the superpower in the midst of the Cold War and of the Russian Empire, rising up into the early 20th century. So I don't know why they're considering Greenland to be irrelevant. They obviously don't, but they know they just can't do anything about it, like you said, Dmitry. So they're going to try to pretend that it doesn't really matter. But we're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the negotiations going on in Abu Dhabi here in a second. But some of the other things discussed at the World Economic Forum and everything were, Trump saying he's going to start drilling in Venezuela very, very soon. And in Venezuela, regarding that, we heard leaked audio from Delcy Rodriguez recently. This was big. She said, the regime never imagined a U.S. intervention in Caracas so flawless and devastating from the United States. Diosdado Cabello, Jorge Padrino, or Vladimir Padrino Lopez, Jorge, the other people, Delcy Rodriguez, others had 15 minutes to decide whether to cooperate with the U.S. or not under the threat of being neutralized. And, if that's true, then that, very impressive operation by the U.S. People have said that, very sophisticated technology was used. We wonder why the 32 Cuban mercenaries were returned in very small boxes that clearly would not have been able to hold like a full body of a person. So I don't know, was some eldritch horror released on these people? Was it like Bigfoot or some weird dragon was released on them that dismembered these people? I have no idea. Some weird Fringe, if anyone ever saw that show, or, some kind of weird sci-fi nonsense going on. But, according to this, these people were under direct threat of being neutralized. And, this could be, attempts from these people to save face. They could have just given Maduro up, days ago and were never actually in any danger. But this could be them trying to justify what they are experiencing right now. I guess we'll never fully understand. But the other big news in that region, at least, is, and this is from Anti-War here, it says, Trump plotting regime change in Cuba by the end of the year, says Wall Street Journal. The Donald Trump administration hopes to execute a regime change in Cuba by the end of 2026, according to sources cited by the Wall Street Journal. The report comes just weeks after the U.S. military kidnapped Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro on dubious drug charges. The newspaper said Washington is now searching for Cuban government insiders who can help cut a deal to push out the communist regime by the end of the year, with senior U.S. officials holding regular meetings with Cuban exiles and pressure groups in recent months. This is obviously all coming from Marco Rubio, who is part of the Cuban exile community in Florida, who have, strong influence over Republican conservative politics and are, seeing what successful the Maduro operation was and thinking it's finally time to put an end to the Cuban saga, which would not be surprised if the shutters are closed on that too. So the Russians, at some point, they're going to have to make a stand, or look, no more Syria, no more Venezuela, no more Cuba, potentially no more Iran. I mean, what's next? You're going to give up like Belarus as well. At a certain level, you're losing all of your allies here. You gotta make a stand. Not everyone can be China and be either, a peer power to the United States. So we're going to be watching Cuba. Obviously, I mean, there was the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s over, Russia's right to, put things in Cuba and testing their alliance with Cuba, and, America's tolerance for Russian missiles, on their hemisphere and whatnot. So, but unfortunately, if Cuba just falls, you can make the argument that current Russia is, a pale comparison of what the Soviet Union was even in the 1960s, which I don't think Putin or Russian people would want to admit. But at a certain level, like how do you judge a regime's power? But yeah, Venezuela, unfortunately, it seems that they will be cooperating and doing everything that the United States wants. No surprise there, of course, but whether Russia and China will be able to have any influence there is yet to be seen. But I have a strong feeling that they are now going to be far less involved. So that's what's going on there. Obviously, as we move towards discussing Russia and Ukraine, this week the French forces boarded a Russian oil tanker. This one, I think it's the 7th one now that's been boarded. The Russian Shadow Fleet is being targeted directly. This latest one was called Grinch. Interesting name there, but obviously the targeting of the Shadow Fleet is an escalation, from the international community. Europe, they're sort of running out of options. Zelensky is calling on the need for a united European army, as others would say. So, but until that really occurs, I guess the best they can do is, board these shadow tankers in these fleets. Some Iranian ships have come under here. Obviously, the main tanker wars have been going on in the Southern Caribbean. But I think once, obviously once things start flying, missiles start flying with Iran and Israel and America, and that really goes down, all tankers from one country or another will be viable targets for everybody else. So global trade could face a real issue once this gets started. That's always the fear from an economics perspective. So we'll see if Trump's supposed amazing economy that he has been touting is going to continue. But we got to talk about the negotiations going on in Abu Dhabi. Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on the tanker situation? And what do you think about the latest propositions we've seen? It seems that Trump seems to be willing to cede almost all the current territory the Russians occupy, but they also want $800 billion to rebuild Ukraine. So wonder what these negotiations are if they're going to lead to anything at all.
Well, I think one of the biggest moments in this entire tanker seizure, Conrad, is that there is no official. I mean, obviously, Maria Zakharova, with the seizing of one of the earlier tankers, of course, she requested for the release of the Russian crews. So at least the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation at least takes some responsibility that, hey, these are Russian citizens. They should be, freed from under arrest, and they should return to their works on the ship docks or wherever they initially came from, right? So it's very interesting how the Russian Federation just allowing these ships to be taken. There's no resistance. All the Russian nuclear submarines, which are no doubt, the nuclear submarine that recently came up in La Manche between France and England, it literally resurfaced there amidst all these NATO countries and went for repairs back in the Baltic Sea, somewhere near St. Petersburg. It literally signaled that Russian nuclear submarines do in fact exist around all these NATO countries, but they are well and truly not responding to their own fellow water neighbors, the gas and oil transportation, the illegal crude selling ships being taken over by essentially NATO forces. At this point, France has joined into this entire conundrum. So it's just quite curious how all of that works, obviously, because this is all under the table, apparently illegal sales, even though international law doesn't really matter to us, does it? Especially after Venezuela. But Russia, I think, is justified in trying to sell as much oil as it can. It just, at this point, the Trump administration is trying to put as much pressure on Russia as possible to keep it at the negotiations table where it's seated at the moment with no issues on that particular front whatsoever. I think the evidence of that is where Vladimir Putin recently has essentially admitted to, well, I think if we have to kind of interpret what he said, because after promising to give $1 billion to Trump's Board of Peace, Vladimir Putin said, look, that $1 billion is going to come from Russia's frozen assets, right, in Brussels. So the 275 to 300 billion American dollars that Russia has frozen, about 75 billion of those dollars, by the way, are private assets of Russian citizens. So these are not in any way related to the Russian government. These are just private investments that Russians have made into European banks, hedge funds, etc., purchasing European assets. So all those funds, of course, are still frozen. They have been for the last 4 years now. And it's just quite curious that Putin is willing to allocate $1 billion. I mean, who did Putin ask? Did he ask permission from any of his economic advisors to do that, to hand that money over to Jared Kushner's Gaza project? That money belongs to the Russian people. So again, there's this sort of gift giving amidst essentially a civilizational war against Satanism, as per the former defense minister Shoigu, is just a little bit strange. How does, of course, giving $1 billion to Jared Kushner's project benefit Russians? Again, this is all very questionable stuff. And in relation to reparations, President Putin did make a very strange statement. He said, potentially, we will be using the frozen funds in Brussels once they're unfrozen in order to rebuild the damaged Ukrainian territories. He said that, and people initially interpreted that as, right, so these frozen funds will be used to rebuild, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, Lugansk, because clearly these are Russian territories, which Russian funds will help rebuild. But those territories are now not Ukrainian territories. They're Russian territories, according to the Russian constitution that Vladimir Putin himself amended. So they should be called Russian territories. Why did he refer to them as Ukrainian? Until I think the red flags were raised and people said, hold up, what if Vladimir Putin is actually talking about rebuilding actual Ukrainian territories, which will remain Ukrainian after the ceasefire and the peace plans have been signed, including Sumskaya Oblast, for example, Zhytomyr City, Kyivskaya Oblast, Lvovskaya Oblast. What if those frozen funds will be literally sent over like Treaty of Versailles-style reparations to help rebuild Zelensky's Ukraine? Now, that would be a tragedy. In fact, when countries usually win wars, Conrad, they don't repay reparations, right? They don't pay reparations to the losing country. And that's exactly what President Putin proposed here. So again, whether or not this is a dementia slip or a slip of the tongue, perhaps he meant, look, these funds will go towards Kherson, Zaporozhye. In any case, this is one of the big concessions of Russia recently, because prior to this, there was never a discussion of any reparations or those frozen funds going to where Trump will tell you they will go, right? So, and the EU and NATO, they will point the finger, and Big Daddy Trump, as per Mark Rutte, will tell you where to invest your own frozen, seized funds. Just very telling as to who exactly is in control. Speaking of control, obviously we had a very slew of diplomatic meetings, as you mentioned earlier, Conrad. Zelensky flew to Davos to meet with Trump, which lasted about 15 minutes. Zelensky gave a speech, etc. That was all done and dusted. And literally hours after that, we had Jared Kushner, Joshua Greenbaum, sort of a new member of the Trump administration specializing in the rebuilding of Gaza, a member of the Orthodox Talmudic community, shall we say, again, and Steve Witkoff. The three of them met up with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin with Kirill Dmitriev as well and Ushakov. I'm actually not sure if Dmitriev was there, but actually Dmitriev was there, and so was Ushakov as well, one of the Russian deputy foreign ministers. They met in that same room, in that white room with the long table and the statue of Alexander II, which is, again, very symbolic. Again, this is one of the main meeting rooms since the late 1990s, where Russian sort of miniature diplomatic discussions take place. It's located in the Kremlin Senate building, where, again, the presidential headquarters are also located in the presidential library in the Kremlin complex. So quite a symbolic meeting once again. This is the 7th visit of Steve Witkoff to Russia in recent years. And it's quite telling that the Trump administration is banking on Russia actually agreeing to these future ceasefire, like 28-point peace plan or whatever is being planned behind the scenes. This literally took place hours after Zelensky flew to Davos. And then mere hours after that, you had, of course, Dmitriev literally transport himself somehow. But these jet planes must be flying. I think the global warming outcomes of all of this are, of course, humongous. So Kirill Dmitriev went all the way to Abu Dhabi, so United Arab Emirates, just outside of Dubai, and has met up for the first day of talks between Russia and Ukraine. These are the next stage, right? The next stage of talks. They've been restarted. And Kirill Dmitriev was, of course, met with one of his colleagues in the discussion. So on the Russian side, you had Kirill Dmitriev and you had Admiral Igor Kostyukov. Now, even though he's an admiral by profession and in the Soviet Navy, he, of course, served in the highest positions. In the Russian Federation, he was made from, I think, 2018, the head of the military intelligence, the GRU. So Igor Kostyukov, as the head of the military intelligence, GRU, and Kirill Dmitriev, they're both essentially balancing out that military side with Admiral Kostyukov and the economic considerations, Kirill Dmitriev himself, which I think all agree that Kirill Dmitriev, being a former employee of Goldman Sachs, a former financial advisor to the Talmudic oligarch of Ukraine, Viktor Pinchuk, he shouldn't even be in this sort of negotiating position for the future of the Orthodox Christian Russian world. These are really strange figures to be negotiating anything, but nevertheless, that's who essentially is on board for the Russian discussion. On the Ukrainian side, you had, again, Umerov for Ukraine. Notice Medinsky isn't here, right? Vladimir Medinsky, the Russian YouTube historian, so the man who, of course, educates Putin on Russian history. He's been essentially pushed out of the way, I think, after the failures of Ankara and Istanbul. He's been kind of sidelined since he didn't manage to achieve anything besides, of course, the release and the exchange of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers' bodies on the front lines. So Abu Dhabi, day one, has essentially finished. The negotiations have, of course, concluded just this Friday. The interesting outcome from that, Conrad, is that apparently Russia and Ukraine, they both agree on both sides. There's almost no negatives besides the one point of contention is the question of territories. Who will get what territory? And we've spoken on this show, Conrad, again, will Ukraine concede and give Russia Kherson, for example, or Zaporozhye, the Russian constitutional territories which are still held? Will Ukraine concede and give Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, these reinforced Ukrainian strongholds, to Russia? Will Russia, for example, concede and actually freely give up Energodar and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to power Ukrainian cities such as Dnipro and Zaporozhye, whomever it belongs to? There are all these, I think, logistical questions, and Trump himself admitted that at the moment the main point of contention is territory, not will there be peacekeeping troops, not the question of what will happen to the Russian frozen funds. So I think in some case, the peace party in the President Putin's administration in United Russia, they're in fact winning over I would say, the wartime lobby. I think we are looking at the creation of essentially a Minsk III type agreement. For whatever reason, Russia, despite all of its victories on the front lines and pushing the Ukrainians further westwards and taking all these key cities throughout the last 2 years, and even pushing back the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk, is just forced almost, or at least pressured, and the pressure seems to be working. They are actually being forcefully brought to the negotiating table, and all these big statements in the past of Russia taking Odessa or Russia taking Nikolaev and pushing further westwards and liberating Ukrainian land and securing, of course, liberty and sovereignty for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. These discussions are all being, again, sidelined, swept under the rug. It's all very tedious, and it does smell like a Minsk free, at least to me. And Abu Dhabi, day one, at least, points me towards that, as well as President Putin's strange talks about potential reparations. So on the diplomatic end, Conrad, despite all of Russia's victories on the front lines, things are looking very strange and somewhat unprecedented. You wouldn't expect this sort of discussion to happen, say, 3 years ago. Things have certainly changed and shifted. I don't know if this is because Trump has aura and Trump is mogging everybody, or to sort of use that Zoomer terminology, but it certainly appears to be the case, at least on the PR end of things.
Yeah, Zelensky claims that agreements and deals on security guarantees for Ukraine are pretty much done. It's just the war itself has to end, and then they can sign those agreements. So I don't know if that means that Russia somehow agrees to the rump state of Ukraine or whatever that will look like in the future, having all sorts of Article 5 like security guarantees. That does sound a lot like that does sound a lot like a Minsk 3, like you said, Dmitry. So we really have to look at all of this and wonder what's to come. Because again, if they're not even willing to take the cities of Kherson and Zaporozhye, what have we been doing this whole time, claiming they're going to take Odessa and Kharkov and all these other places? They're really going to have made us look stupid if they don't actually, push this further than it really needs to go, right? So hopefully some things change. And as the prophecies say, as I've said since the very beginning of the show, the Russians will do what needs to be done, not because they want to or they're idealists or romantics, but because they're raw, naked pragmatists, and the sheer reality of the situation will force them to do so, which, frankly, if they were raw, naked pragmatists, they could just do that now and save themselves a lot of trouble. But unfortunately, like many people, they have to be mugged by reality before they do the right thing. But as far as the actual situation at the front line, Dmitry, what is going on? How has Russia been advancing slowly but surely, as has been the trend?
The best progress is actually recorded on the Kharkovskaya angle. So again, that key city of Kharkov, just 47 kilometers away from the actual city itself. The village of Semyonovka was taken by the Russians. So that victory recorded in late 2025, and the Russians confirmed to have taken Volchansk, over which they fought for a good 24 months plus, right? Pushing the border away from Belgorod, which at the moment is suffering still from a lack of electricity, the snowfall, and all the other issues, which again, the Ukrainians have also been suffering from in the cities of Odessa and Kiev for a long time. The Russians have taken Semyonovka, so it does look like there is a potential upcoming, again, if the war extends itself into late 2026, 2027, there will be potentially an incursion onto Kharkov, which, again, we've all been waiting for a long time. Kharkov is not just the second largest city of Ukraine, it's also the most Russian city of Ukraine, you can almost say, potentially even more Russian than some of the territories of the Donbass. So just keep in mind, throughout Russia's entire history, Kharkov was always seen as this like industrial Velikorussian. It's more Velikorussian than it is Malorussian in some ways. So there's a lot of people pointing really towards potentially Kharkov being that big gambling chip in a way in Russia's arsenal, potentially if the peace and ceasefire talks really meet a dead end. The Battle of Kupiansk at the moment, this is the other city in the Kharkovsk Oblast, has really turned into a battle of attrition. So the Ukrainian forces are pulling in more and more reserves to the outposts of Kupiansk and sending them in. Russian drone operators are literally striking Ukrainian vehicles and military equipment on the outskirts of the city. And in the city center, there are still engagements. So notice, even though the Russians have secured Kupiansk to a large part, and Andrei Belousov last week and already announced Kupiansk has fallen, we're just cleaning up. The cleanup is quite active and violent. So let's just say Kupiansk, well and truly, despite being controlled by Russia, still has Ukrainian military cells all over the place. It's not a safe zone by any stretch. You will not see Belousov or Vladimir Putin or any Russian politician traveling to Kupiansk with a telephone and filming live stream or taking photographs. It's just too dangerous for that. There are apparently reports that Ukraine, in particular the Ukrainian drone commander Brody, has begun the massive project of rearming Ukraine's drone forces. They're increasing Ukrainians' drone capacity to, this is quite horrific, and I would just say again, post-apocalyptic, 5 million drones, which we know Ukraine had over 2 million drones last year, but that number is set to at least double in the next year or so, which is absolutely insane. Again, notice Ukrainians are, by the way, buying drone parts from China as well. So these BRICS countries are in fact supplying hardware for Ukrainians to then turn into these homemade weapons. Again, NATO is also supplying a large part, explosives and other things for Ukraine to be utilizing against Russian citizens, civilians, and military alike. So quite intense. The Kharkovsk Oblast is obviously where the majority of the major fighting is taking place. Of course, the other one is the Donetsk Oblast, Konstantinovka, still situational fighting in the city itself. The city has not, in fact, fallen to Russia as of yet. They're still, of course, fighting in a similar capacity to that of, I would say, Pokrovsk, which took a little while for Russia to really push into and to then make that surround of Mirnograd happen. So again, there's reports, really interestingly, the Talmudic mayor of Kiev, the one who owns several, I've heard claims of hundreds of brothels across Ukraine. The mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, has said that Kiev is its residents have to basically leave. There's people in the city who have no energy whatsoever in their apartments. Apparently 2,000 apartment buildings. So notice this number is almost 20 times the number we reported on last week. So the reports from Kiev are very different, but maybe this is an exaggeration, but 2,000 apartment buildings in the city are left without heating during the coldest winter that Eastern Europe has seen in the last 150 years. This is a huge humanitarian crisis. Obviously, there's footage of Zelensky sitting on a laptop doing Teams meetings and Zoom meetings with Ukrainian staff in a building with the lights turned off to sort of symbolize that, look, I don't have lights and heating in my house, which is complete BS. Obviously, you're sitting there like in a t-shirt indoors and just turns off the light for symbolism purposes. So the PR public relations media battle is well and truly raging. Unfortunately, the Russians are not striking any Ukrainian. There's no news about Russians striking Ukrainian decision-making centers. The National Bank, the Central Bank of Ukraine, has not been struck yet. The administrative buildings of Ukrainian SBU military headquarters anywhere in the city of Kiev have not been struck. There are no NATO officers being killed across Kiev, for example. So there's no actual decisive, shall we say, beheading strikes being carried out, at least not this week. If something happens next week, we'll make sure to report on it. So there are no insane updates on that particular end. And more updates on the front lines, of course. There's huge shellings actually taking place in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, interestingly enough, in Pavlograd, Kirov, Rog. Dnipro itself is being hit by long-range Russian bombardment. I think, Conrad, those bombs are actually falling from the Russian forces in the Zaporozhye. So as they're approaching, they're very close to Zaporozhye city, but they're actually shooting these long-range projectiles and missiles from their forces stationed there in order to, I guess, attack Ukrainian logistics lines, because Dnipro itself really hasn't been hit in a very long time now. But drone forces, of course, are being mobilized on both ends. The battle of Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Radinsk being somewhat on the finished side. So that particular front being secured is, again, a feather in Russia's cap. Russia's really using that incentive to push further out towards Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But there are no updates on the Svetogorsk monastery. The Russians are no nearer to liberating it than they were last week. But we know well and truly this will be like the last threshold. In fact, as soon as you hear about Slavyansk, Kramatorsk being besieged by Russia, then you should know that I think Western powers, including Zelensky, will sit their bums down very promptly and hastily at the negotiating table, and there will be some alacrity, because as soon as Russia liberates Donbass, Conrad, they'll be looking further west towards Dnipro, towards Zaporozhye city, and maybe even, as I said earlier, towards Kharkiv, and then really the dominoes will begin to fall, and the huge demoralization of the Ukrainian forces will be concluded, because all those massive strongholds that have built up, the Ukrainian, Nezalezhna Ukraina mythology, the Ukrainian resistance in Donbass, it will essentially collapse. And most of those neo-Nazi Banderite regime forces, they were all essentially, most of them were recruits from some of those eastern territories, which will now be under Russian control. So they will be entirely demoralized as well. So all those victories will, I think, snowball into essentially trying to force the Ukrainian administration to either disintegrate within itself, forcing Zelensky out, or potentially for them to bring themselves to the negotiating table and making massive concessions. So I do agree with Putin, in that if we can't get Ukraine to concede diplomatically on Russian constitutional territories, that will be forced upon Ukraine through military means, because as the old saying goes, a warfare is simply an extension of diplomacy and ambassadorial work. So that's exactly, I think, what we're seeing at the moment. But beyond all of that, we're clearly going to watch the talks in Abu Dhabi, exactly how they will progress. They may take a week. Medinsky is not at the head of it. Obviously, we'll see what Kirill Dmitriev will bring about. We don't, of course, have too many hopes for the Russian reliance on Chabad Lubavitch, when literally Chabad seems to be running the show, not just in Gaza and the border peace there, but also in Russia proper. The diplomacy, Conrad, I think on the diplomatic end of things, it's almost entirely somehow integrated with some of these Orthodox Jewish communities from Eastern America. It's just very strange. It's very, I think the history books will be very judgmental, I think, on the Russian regime, sort of negotiating with these particular people. Or perhaps maybe this isn't an insult to Vladimir Putin. It's just he understands who's in charge of America in reality, and he's just speaking to literally the people in charge. It doesn't have to be a white man. It has to be a person with a particular religious background. So maybe Vladimir Putin is just a big-time pragmatist and realist, and he knows I have to speak to Kushner, I have to speak to Witkoff, Greenbaum, and not, some American general or admiral, because these Greenbaums and Kushners, they actually are the real wielders of power in the United States. And in that case, that would be, I think, insulting to the average American because, hey, guess what? The country is actually subjugated to what people may refer to as Zog.
Just say no to Zog, as Randy Weaver used to say. I have that shirt as well, but it's true, unfortunately, it looks like, the Russia-Ukraine situation, as I said earlier, things are going to move the way they will because of necessity, not because of idealism or some kind of new vision, I guess, that the Russian current establishment has for the region and the world. But, as we move away from that region, obviously we're going to be watching all of this very closely, specifically Iran. Quick update on that. This is from Middle East Spectator. 4 KC-135 Stratotankers just left the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, for unknown reasons, obviously. In theory, the only planes that will be left there will be defensive planes like the ones the Royal Air Force has there, and everything else would be evacuated because Al Udeid, the Iranians already hit Al Udeid. Of course, they would hit it again on top of other United States bases in the region. So, it's clear the U.S., they want to pull out of all these places in Syria and Iraq and other places because they've realized now at a certain level with missile technology in our Navy, it's just a hazard to have these land bases with these troops stationed there. Those are just easy targets for the Iranians and these other people to strike when we can just send in our Navy and operate from Israel and Jordan in a much more leisurely way. But moving here to the United States to briefly discuss some domestic news before we move on to church news. Of course, the situation in Minnesota continues to develop. ICE and DHS, their operation there has expanded. Now there have been massive protests. Tens of thousands of people have taken to the streets against ICE. More people have been disrupting the immigration enforcement, and there have been injunctions into their actions. But very recently, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit, they temporarily lifted restriction on ICE's use of force against protesters. So it's going to be a lot harder for people to interfere. But of course, the big news recently was the storming of that church, I believe City Church. It's a Protestant church where one of the elders of the church is a regional ICE coordinator from Minnesota. And Don Lemon and a bunch of other local leftists stormed the church and saying they were white supremacists and all this stuff. And some of the people have been prosecuted, but the prosecutor's office, they've refused to prosecute Don Lemon. He claimed he was doing journalism. They prosecuted some of the activists, but obviously these people were clearly committing a crime, disrupting a worship service like that. But of course, gay-black privilege exists in America. So Don Lemon, everyone's favorite disgraced gay-black news anchor, has the privilege to not go to jail for just committing a blatant crime. So it's unfortunate to see that, but unfortunately, all of this fanfare, and Nick Fuentes, he's talked about this extensively, but all this fanfare for what will amount to only 3,000 arrests, which we know probably half of those won't even result in convictions. So all this massive fanfare, Trump's at 37% popularity, all of the gains he made with young people and minorities, specifically Hispanics, have completely reversed and gone the other direction right now. All for what? What's going to result in a few hundred prosecutions for Somalians committing fraud and, maybe a few hundred deportations. If you're going to do this, you're going to turn the public against you and have yourself perceived as a fascist running a, Gestapo deportation operation. You have to actually do it. You have to actually commit to the bid. You have to actually deport thousands and thousands of people. If you're not going to do that, you hype up the enemy, you're going to lose. The reaction electorally is going to be terrible. The cultural backlash is going to be terrible. You thought the January 6th thing was bad. They're going to be coming after former ICE agents, people that, were literally following the law and enforcing the law. The next regime comes around, they're going to be considered criminals, going to be, post hoc prosecuted. That's the kind of thing these people are going to do. They're going to stack the Supreme Court. They're going to go crazy with it. If you cross the Rubicon rhetorically, but don't actually do it, you're just allowing the other side to cross the Rubicon and then actually do it. So that's unfortunately what we seem to be witnessing right now with Trump. So as much as I support ICE and immigration enforcement, it's all just too little too late at this point in a lot of ways. But the other big news is, and by big news I just mean is interesting to me because I don't like Canada and I want it to stop existing. Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, he said recently, he said, Albertans are very independent people. There's a rumor they may have a referendum on whether they want to stay in Canada or not. People are talking. People want sovereignty. They want what the U.S. has got. And Trump's proposed ambassador to Iceland, his nominee, also said that maybe Iceland would be the 52nd state, sort of implying that if the U.S. takes Greenland, they'll also be getting Iceland because it would be very relevant for the security there. And Iceland, used to be part of Denmark, so similar sort of deal there. Only a few 100,000 people in Iceland anyway, so the arguments largely apply. But, Albertan independence, it's true there will likely be a referendum if they can achieve a certain amount of signatures by a certain date. There will be a referendum, and then I think the referendum will be on holding a vote or something like that, or I don't know exactly how the referendum will be worded exactly, but Albertan independence has never been polling higher, and young people in Alberta, I believe for 40% of them are likely to say they support an independent Alberta, which I think an independent Alberta in theory means very likely the joining of America of Alberta, which would be very interesting, quite the interesting change on the map. But if that happens, I see Quebec independence following soon afterwards. Then who knows what British Columbia will do? They'll have to work something out with Ottawa or potentially with the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Because if that goes on, maybe Washington and Oregon and maybe even California would be like, you know what, we're out of the United States. And they form some new West Coast Cascadia libtard nation states. So all sorts of interesting things are coming as the world map changes, not just in the Middle East and Eastern Europe where war rages, but also as America annexes territory and, North American nation states fall apart. So a lot of interesting stuff. Any final thoughts maybe on Russia, Ukraine, Dimitri, as well as thoughts on the ICE situation and the Minnesota crackdown, as well as this Alberta independence situation before we talk about church news?
Yeah, I just think that generally, obviously, this is a double-sided sword. Clearly, this is ICE cracking down on, in particular, you have the leftists, the left-wingers, which, again, they only wish the worst for America. So generally speaking, I don't feel any sympathy towards any of these leftists being cracked down on. Their behavior is piggish. They've contributed actually to the downfall of American culture over the last 30, 40 years. Left-wingers, these hipsters, hippies, etc. These are the people that our saints have warned about, especially those in Rocor over the last few years. These are followers of the Antichrist religion of the future, as per Father Seraphim Rose. These are the adepts, the acolytes. So there's no real issue of ICE essentially cracking down upon them. But you do need to keep in mind, behind the scenes, Conrad, there is a big surveillance state being pushed. And again, most of our listeners probably are aware of this. Just yesterday, actually, there was confirmation that the completion of TikTok's acquisition by Oracle is just another sort of move in this particular direction. So that's kind of, it's being paraded around as an anti-China acquisition, but I think generally it's just to keep the reins of social media in control of, the forces that be, in order to, shall we say, kosherize the agenda, at least in America. Because as you said at the beginning of the episode, Conrad, when we were analyzing the Middle East, a lot of regular American people, they've had enough of Israel. They've had enough of America standing up for Israel, for the Zionist regime there. And of course, many people are now aware that essentially the AIPAC lobby and the lobbying of American politicians is well and truly a long-standing tradition. And Tucker Carlson, in fact, has contributed to this. I just want to mention one more thing, just on the Tucker Carlson, and he, despite all of his great interviews and his interviewing of Nicolas J. Fuentes recently, he has in fact interviewed quite a controversial Russian figure. This ties to the Russian-Ukrainian war, Conrad, Sergei Karaganov. I think this interview took place about 7 or 8 days ago. And he calls Tucker Carlson's interview, the slogan of it is, well, this is the top political advisor of President Putin being interviewed. And I took a look at the video, and about 30 minutes in, Karaganov's goblin-like face comes on with a hook nose and spiky ears. And, quite to my horror, because I didn't expect Karaganov to be interviewed. Just for reference, Karaganov, he is the nephew or the grandnephew of a Moscow rabbi. This rabbi was kicked out of Moscow by, if I'm not mistaken, Grand Duke Serge back in the day, in the 1890s. So Karaganov himself, although positioning himself as a Russian, is not that. We know who he belongs to. He's a member of the Talmudic tribe. And Tucker Carlson interviews him and gives him all these laurels, saying, wow, you must be the wise advisor of Putin. And if he, in fact, is the advisor of Putin, which I doubt, I think he's more of like a talking head. Like, essentially, he is who people claim Alexander Dugin is, right? He does have President Putin's audience, and he's invited almost every single press conference President Putin does. Karaganov almost always asks a question from Putin, and now he's there with Tucker Carlson. And the most disgusting thing was, it's not just that he appeared on the interview, right, this nephew of a rabbi, and positioned and portrayed himself as a Russian, which he isn't, is that he actually proclaimed that, look, if the SMO is going to go in the wrong direction, if Russia doesn't meet its goals, Conrad, Russia should nuke has to nuclear strike Germany and England. And then he said Germany is one of the countries responsible for some of the worst crimes of the 20th century. So we shouldn't be too alarmed if Russia needs to nuke Berlin, for example, or London. So we have a nephew of a rabbi saying this and portraying himself as the advisor of Putin. Tucker himself is interviewing this guy and listening to this. And Tucker, with his, eyebrows crossed, the concerned face, is listening to this and saying, wow, I mean, this is quite scary. So notice the Russian administration refuses to destroy the bridges over the Dnieper, refuses to destroy the railways leading from NATO European countries into Ukraine, refuses to take down any of the centers of decision-making in Kiev. But Karaganov is telling us that Russia needs to nuke Berlin and London, President Putin's advisor, apparently. This is Talmudic. Anyone who speaks about using nuclear weapons tactically or wholesale against European countries just because is, of course, serving Zog in and of itself. So Tucker Carlson really didn't do anybody a service by interviewing this, not just charlatan, but I think he's one of the people obviously controlling the deep state in Russia, Karaganov. So absolutely disgusting. So I don't recommend anyone listen to that interview with Tucker Carlson, but just if you will be listening, just keep in mind I do have evidence that he is in fact the nephew or grandnephew of a rabbi, quite obnoxious and gross.
That makes a lot of sense. And, people have speculated that Tucker, he's had connections with the Mercer family in the past, and they have connections to Russian Jewry. And, Tucker, despite being very Israel critical, and some have said, anti-Semitic and, kind of dog whistling and naming them, he has always made it very clear that he's anti-Zionist, he's anti, the current government of Israel, but he's pro-Jewish and he loves Jews and everything like that. So, perhaps, that extends to his, elevation of this Talmudic character, and how, maybe the idea that Russia supports Israel, but they also support Palestine in this way, the way Tucker might have the exact position of Russia. Tucker might be the most aligned with the Putin government than anybody. They're pro-Jewish and pro-Israel, but they still support Palestine and things like this. And, they think some good things about Iran, and they're, they're pro, family, and they're traditional, but they would never be anti-Semitic, this sort of thing. So very interesting remarks there from Tucker. But we have to move on to some church news here as we start to get to the end of the show finally, under 2 hours here on World War Now, return to form once again here in 2026. But some of the biggest news of the persecutions in Ukraine, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, Dimitri, are the updates on Metropolitan Arseny. This is from Ortho Christian. It says His Eminence Metropolitan Arseny of Svyatogorsk. And remember, guys, Svyatogorsk Monastery is currently basically in the gray zone, maybe a few miles away, but effectively in the contested zone between Russia and Ukraine right now. It says, Arseny of Svyatogorsk of the canonical UOC will remain in pretrial detention for another 60 days after a Dnipro court granted prosecutors' motion to extend his detention until March 22. He's in Dnipropetrovsk, the home of the largest synagogue in Europe, I believe. The court denied the defense's request to change the restraint measure and denied urgent hospitalization, reports the Information Education Department of the UOC. Metropolitan Arseny participated in the hearings online, declaring his innocence and emphasizing his need for complex heart surgery. On January 21st, a medical professor from Kiev participated remotely in the court session, presenting an expert conclusion on the Svyatogorsk Lavra abbot's health condition based on available diagnoses. According to him, the hierarchy requires comprehensive examination in specialized clinics, inpatient treatment, and subsequent rehabilitation, and the medications currently prescribed are not only not helping, but are harming the Metropolitan's health. Ukrainian Orthodox believers came to the courtroom to support the Metropolitan. The Holy Door Mission Svyatogorsk Lavra calls on clergy and faithful to offer prayers for the imprisoned Metropolitan Arseny. The defense is preparing appeals, the report notes. And then to provide some background here for those that we've covered this extensively on the show before, but of course, Metropolitan Arseny was initially detained on April 25th, 2024 for mentioning a military checkpoint in a homily months prior and held for nearly 2 years before being released on October 28th, 2025. And after his lawyer secured bail in the amount of 1.5 million hryvnias, which is about $36,000. However, immediately upon exiting the detention facility, security service officers met the Metropolitan and presented him with new charges that had been issued 3 weeks earlier. He was eventually transferred back to the detention facility. Doctors determined in late September that the hierarch urgently needs heart surgery. Since the beginning of hostilities in eastern Ukraine, Metropolitan Arseny regularly supported people affected by the conflict, with the Svyatogorsk Lavra serving as a shelter for thousands of people amid the war. So, Dimitri, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Metropolitan Arseny situation, because we also have even anti-UOC religious scholars are admitting that the UOC has remained much stronger than the OCU in the midst of the war, despite the horrendous persecutions like Metropolitan Arseny and other confessors like him are experiencing.
No, absolutely. And this just displays that, despite the fact that the USC has been prevented from actually bringing orthodox, clarification to the Ukrainian troops, still the majority of the laypersons of Ukraine, so the regular people who have to decide upon which church to go to, OCU or USC, are in fact, the majority of them are choosing the USC. And the USC does, Metropolitan Onufry is pro-Ukraine in the most patriotic, nationalistic, Orthodox Christian sense. You even have, this is a recent statement from an archbishop whom we haven't quoted before. This is Archbishop Jonah Cherepanov. He's located in the Kiev Oblast, in fact, on the outskirts of the Kiev Central Business District city, just on the bank of the Dnieper. In the southeast of the city of Kiev, there's a small monastery, and Archbishop Jonah is the head of that monastery. It's the Trinity St. Jonah Monastery. But it's not named after St. Jonah from the Old Testament. This is named after, and it has the burial place of St. Jonah of Kiev. This is a interesting saint. I recommend everybody read about St. Jonah of Kiev, 19th century a saint. He died in 1902, a very interesting miracle work. I believe he even had some prophecies attributed to him. So one of the sort of late Ukrainian Orthodox Christian saints before the revolution, very interesting. But Archbishop Jonah essentially said that, look, we as Ukrainians, and he's a member of the USC, so canonical church, he says, we as Ukrainians really, amidst this horrible winter, need to look internally and say, look, perhaps we need to repent, and maybe this entire debacle, these 4 years of conflicts, were sort of foisted upon us because of our lukewarmness, maybe in 2014 and 2013, for the things we've done. Maybe this is God's trying to call us to be sobered up, to repent. And I'm just paraphrasing his sermon that he gave, very brave sermon. Notice, Conrad, the bishops of the USC, on one hand, they don't all proclaim, these crazy pro-Russian slogans that the accusations are thrown at them, but at the same time, they're willing to call their own people to repentance, and yet their church, that's a self-critical call for repentance is quite a dangerous thing to do, because everybody has an ego, and not everyone wants to say sorry or to pray for their own country or admit to their faults in decades past, because they led Ukraine to this situation where the country is split amidst this, quasi-civil war that's taking place now. And yet the popularity is retained, despite all of this and all of the massive persecutions against the bishops. They're not coming from regular people. They're coming from the militarized, essentially NATO-ized Banderite squads, literally the SBU, sometimes directly, just as, with Metropolitan Arseny of Svetogorsk Monastery. It's not the regular people who are taking these bishops and like lynching them or kidnapping them. No, it's the state. The state is doing it. The regular people are not upset with the canonical church. In fact, the evidence of this was given. There was a court hearing in the Cherkasskaya Oblast on the 20th of November 2023, so quite a while ago now, more than 2 years now. There's been a seizure of the nativity of the Theotokos Monastery in Cherkasy. So this is, I think it happened close to the same time as that, the really violent seizure of the Cathedral of Archangel Michael. But this monastery was sieged, and there was a public, caught on camera beating of all these laypersons belonging to the canonical church who tried to defend the monastery of the nativity of the Theotokos from being captured. And now those same victims of the beatings are actually giving testimony, and they're actually being cross-examined in court. They're making these appearances. So the legal system in Ukraine, despite all of its corruption, is still open for the Orthodox Christians to at least try to promote their values and try to at least defend themselves, legally speaking, despite the fact, it's very similar to the late Roman Empire, Conrad. Despite persecutions, the Orthodox Christians really never called for like an internal revolution. They always tried to use the tools of the state to their benefit as much as possible without calling for a destabilization of their society, which is what's happening in the Ukraine. Members of the USC, be it clergymen or laypersons, are not calling for Ukraine to fall apart. They're calling to call the people of Ukraine to repentance first and foremost, an end to the bloodshed, which is, I think, what the peace talks are all about. Hopefully, I hope it's not a mincemeat. I hope it's a genuine attempt for everybody to put their weapons down. And the laypersons and clergy are calling for just the ability to worship without worrying that their church will be raided by bandits, mercenaries, or members of the Ukrainian intelligence who probably have better things to do at this point. So generally, it's not surprising that the USC is retaining all of this, I would say, all the faithful within its walls, simply because it has this really strong, nuanced, righteousness is on its side. It's never betrayed its own population, and it's never had these weird, shady, under the table dealings with the EP in order to legitimize it. Legitimacy comes from its history, its tradition, its resistance to Bolshevism in decades past, and I think that's where the resilience, I think, comes from in the end.
We have to keep all these persecuted hierarchs, these new confessors of the faith. Again, there's also, probably dozens, hundreds of martyrs that we we'll never really fully understand about until the war is over. And even then, we'll probably never really know, what happened on the front lines, what really happened in some of these recruitments, these forced mobilizations, what really happened in some of these church stormings and some of these clergy that, they'll claim died in the war, but were potentially, taken out, as it were. So we need to continue to pray for Ukraine. Some of the most egregious examples of Christian persecution continually going on to this day. My only other update regarding church news is this Finnish archbishop, the EP church in Finland, which we are really no fans of here at World War Now. They are by far I have no problem saying the worst part of the Orthodox Church. But the Finnish Archbishop Ilya of Helsinki, he released a clarifying statement. A picture was released of him with the false, quote-unquote, Metropolitan of Montenegro, the schismatic Montenegrin Orthodox Church, which ironically the SVR of Russia, the Foreign Intelligence Service, said in that report recently that the EP, Constantinople, the Fanar, were pursuing relations with this schismatic body against the local Serbian Orthodox Church in Montenegro. But the Archbishop of Helsinki said, a fleeting encounter in Rome with someone dressed as a bishop who introduced himself as being from Montenegro, a photograph taken in that moment, and from this a narrative is spun. Let this serve as a textbook example of how disinformation is manufactured and shamelessly disseminated. There were no negotiations. There was no meeting. What occurred was a one-sided 2-minute encounter, the kind that happens at any large gathering where people cross paths. Those who wish to construct elaborate stories from chance encounters may draw their own conclusions. The rest of us recognize this for what it is, the anatomy of a lie. Well, no one reporting on it was really lying. The Montenegrin schismatics obviously posted about it, claiming that they had met. He said they had posted something saying that Metropolitan Boris, together with the delegation of the Montenegrin Orthodox Church, met with an ecumenical delegation from Finland, which included Tapio Luoma, Archbishop of Turku and all Finland of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, and Ilya Valgren, Archbishop of Helsinki and all Finland, primate of the Finnish Orthodox Church. So that was just their claim, the ones that posted the picture. The UOJ and other outlets, reported on it. And then I guess there's somehow a problem from this archbishop. Well, doesn't really matter what he thinks. He recognizes Lutheran baptisms despite them being a gay church with female bishops. They also, I believe, have a gluten-free Eucharist and all sorts of other totally nonsensical things, LGBT-adjacent crap that they're doing. So frankly, I think Finland should really be the territory of the Moscow Patriarchate, if we're being honest. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, Dimitri, and then any final bits of church news before we wrap this episode up.
No, absolutely love the sort of contradictory reports by the Finnish church and the one from Montenegro. I mean, yeah, of course the illegitimate formation in Montenegro. Truth be told, Conrad, it points us towards the reality that, look, the Russian intelligence were correct when they pointed out the Montenegrin schismatic issue to be some sort of primal pressure point that the EP is trying to look into. And even at the time, we're like, look, it's an unpopular church formation. There's no way, right? There's no way it's really happening. But in fact, hey, literally less than a week later, there's this meeting that takes place in Rome, or at least even a chance encounter, an accidental, meeting of the great minds. It just happens, right? Spontaneously. But just some final tidbit stories. There's still a formation of a potential raid that's going to happen on another Kievan monastery in the Golofsevsky monastery, because apparently, as we said last week, this is a Ukrainian Orthodox church, canonical monastery outside of Kiev, because they were teaching their kids during Saturday and Sunday school out of Russian grammar textbooks and math textbooks published in the USSR, right? So that monastery is still being pressured by Ukrainian law enforcement right now as we speak. So we need to keep all those IRO monks and the brothers of that monastery in our prayers. And the other, I think, interesting story, and we should probably mention it in this segment, Conrad, because this person is, of all the Orthodox Christian laypersons, he's probably one of the most impressive, because he actually defended Orthodoxy in the Donbass. One of the first people to organize all of that was Igor Girkin Strelkov on the 22nd of January, 2026. So just a few days ago, 2 days ago, as per the recording of this episode, has filed for his final and ultimate appeal of his prison sentence to the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation. This is the highest, essentially the equivalent of the Supreme Court in America, the highest court in the Russian land. And he essentially is arguing that, he's imprisoned on essentially false charges. He's entirely innocent, and he's asking for the Constitutional Court to look into his matter. I'm very doubtful that this Constitutional, court will release Strelkov, will sort of review properly and review his appeal and review the facts that he's putting forward. But his facts, having looked at the reports and the information provided by his lawyers, is actually quite strong. It's just, unfortunately, we know in the Russian Federation, Igor Strelkov, he crossed certain lines when he began pointing fingers at the Talmudic tribe, when he begins to speak without a filter, and clearly he's hurt a lot of people. So we need to keep him in our prayers, Igor Girkin Strelkov, as much as we need to keep some of the hierarchs being persecuted, because he's an Orthodox Christian who I think, just like Captain Cornelius Zelaya Codriano, he was an Orthodox Christian layperson as well, who was persecuted for his political views despite being a pious Christian layperson in Romania before the Second World War. We're seeing the same thing in the Russian Federation, unfortunately. So the Russian Federation is not free. It's not free of persecution of Orthodox Christians for their views. So just keep all those people in your prayers. I think it'll be worthwhile in the end. It's our duty as Christians to do so, especially if they actually push forward Orthodox Christian tradition and they stick to the commandments of the Lord, as Strelkov has for so many years.
No, we do hope that Strelkov can get out of jail. It's a very unfortunate situation, so we pray for him. We, of course, ask that you, the audience, pray for us, your humble World War Now hosts. Obviously, that's the most important thing you can do. Also, if you want to help us out, worldwarnow.co. Please get behind the paywall. You can get access to the full part 1 of our recent Rasputin episode, which is really part 1 in a 3-part series. So get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. You get access to the full Rasputin series when it comes out. You also get access to the Death of Empire documentary, 4.5-hour documentary you get access to, as well as at this point 100+ episodes of our show Ether Hour, huge interviews, Father Peter Heers, Father John Whiteford, Abbot Trifon, a huge amount of other different episodes, all about the history of the Romanovs, their regicide, all sorts of other czars, all sorts of saints that haven't been canonized yet. We have, again, interviews with people from all over the world, from Syria, this coming week as well on World War Live. I'm going to be having David Erhan, and we're going to be having him on, likely for an Ether Hour as well. So him and some people, I'm not going to spoil it yet, some really, really big guests coming up in future Ether Hour episodes. So please, if you've been on the fence about it, or if you've been listening to the free show for a while, please, if you can find it in your heart and in your wallet, to get behind the paywall at worldwarnow.co. It really helps us out, and you've got some really, really great content coming your way. It's multiple huge 1.5, 2+ hour episodes a week. So you're really getting your money's worth. You get access to premium channels on the Discord, the Q&A threads, which we're going to be trying to be doing monthly now. So you'll be able to ask us any questions you want to be answered in an Ether Hour episode. All of that, plus probably more benefits to come. So again, thank you to those that support us already, and please get behind that paywall at worldwarnow.co and check out the latest episode about Rasputin. Again, one of our most requested episodes, and it's a really, really great episode. So if you want to listen to that, worldwarnow.co, linked below wherever you may be listening to this. But please be sure to like the episode as well. Obviously, follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow the World War Now X account as well, at World War Now _. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So be sure to find us there. Follow us on all of these platforms if you can. Obviously, subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. As I said earlier, I'll be going live as I normally do Tuesday evening, 7:45 Central Time, 8:45 Eastern PM, of course. This time I'll be joined by David Erhan, so we'll be discussing Turkish news, some prophecies and things related to Turkey, and of course playing some ethno-guesser, as we always do. So I hope to see as many of you there as possible. Obviously, we've got some big Ether Hour episodes coming up this week and next week as well. The schedule is packed, frankly, so a lot of big shows coming. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you want to get 10% off Antelope Hill Publishing, go to antelopehillpublishing.com and use code WWN to get 10% off your order of all the books that you order there. So I want to thank them for supporting the show and everything else. I think that is pretty much everything we have to say so far. Again, please like this episode on the Substack, share it, restack it, send it with your friends, send it to anybody that might be interested. If you can, support the show by gifting other people subscriptions, sending the paid subscription option to people that you think might be interested in supporting. It really helps us out. And I think very soon I'm going to be setting up a Buy Me a Coffee. So please let me know if you would support me on Buy Me a Coffee, and I will be probably dropping that in the next time you hear from me. So we'll be having that linked below soon. But with all of that, Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Thank you all for listening. It was a packed episode in preparation for the inevitable, I think, strikes on Iran, unfortunately, that will happen in the Middle East. So stay tuned, connected on X, Telegram. We will be reporting live when I think the event inevitably takes place this week. Everybody take care. Keep me and Conrad in your prayers, and God bless. Thanks for listening.